Later, a new interrogator, one I had not seen before, walked down the row of trees holding a long, sharp knife. I could not make out their words, but he spoke to the pregnant woman and she answered. What happened next makes me nauseous to think about. I can only describe it in the briefest of terms. He cut the clothes off her body, slit her stomach, and took the baby out. I turned away, but there was no escaping the sound of her agony, the screams that slowly subsided into whimpers, and after far too long, lapsed into the merciful silence of death. The killer walked calmly past me, holding the fetus by its neck. When he got to the prison, he tied a string around the fetus and hung it from the eaves with the others, which were dried and black and shrunken. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized control of Cambodia in 1975 and instigated one of the 20th century's most devastating genocides. Driven by Marxist-Leninist ideology, they sought to transform Cambodia into an agrarian utopia, devoid of modern influences and class distinctions. This radical vision resulted in the forced evacuation of cities, mass executions, and widespread famine. Intellectuals, professionals, and anyone associated with the former government were targeted and eliminated. The regime's brutal policies led to the deaths of nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. The origins of the Khmer Rouge can be traced back to the Cambodian communist movement that emerged in the late 1940s and 1950s. Influenced by the anti-colonial struggle against French rule, this movement gradually evolved into a radical insurgency under the leadership of Saleh Sar, who would later be known as Pol Pot. Pol Pot's ideological journey began with his education in France during the early 1950s, where he became heavily influenced by the French Communist Party and exposure to radical leftist thought, cementing his revolutionary ideals. Upon returning to Cambodia, Pol Pot joined the underground communist movement and quickly rose through the ranks. By the early 1960s, he had become a prominent figure within the Cambodian Communist Party, advocating for a violent overthrow of the existing government. In 1963, he became the party's general secretary and began a series of Stalinist purges and executions of his competitors while on his ascent to absolute power. The Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot's leadership, gained momentum through a combination of guerrilla warfare and political maneuvering, exploiting the chaos of the Vietnam War and the subsequent U.S. bombing campaigns in Cambodia. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge had successfully laid siege to the Cambodian capital city of Phnom Penh, toppled the Lon Nol government, and paved the way for Pol Pot's radical and brutal vision of a new Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge immediately set about implementing their radical vision, which they dubbed Year Zero. This concept symbolized a complete reset of Cambodian society, eradicating all traces of the past to forge a new agrarian utopia. The Khmer Rouge promised a classless society devoid of modern influence where everyone would work collectively in the countryside. This vision was presented as a liberation from the inequalities and corruption of the previous regimes, but the reality was far more sinister and brutal. Within days of taking power, the Khmer Rouge's first action was the forced evacuation of all cities, most notably Phnom Penh. Within days, they executed the rich, the college students, former government officials, professionals, police, and soldiers, and the capital's 3 million citizens were marched into the countryside at gunpoint, under the pretext that the move was necessary to protect them from imminent American bombing raids. In truth, the goal was to dismantle urban life and redistribute the population into rural collectives. The Khmer Rouge saw the city as a home to capitalist and foreign ideas, and a haven to supportive bourgeois intellectuals. The evacuees, including the elderly, sick, and children, were given no time to prepare and were subjected to grueling marches without adequate food, water, or medical care. Many perished along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or outright execution by the Khmer Rouge soldiers for failing to keep up. The radio broadcast through Phnom Penh during the evacuations proclaimed, "What is infected must be cut out. What is rotten must be removed. What is too long must be shortened and made the right length. It isn't enough to cut down a bad plant. It must be uprooted. Those corrupted by the city, professionals, businessmen, public officials, teachers, writers, and workers must be eliminated or re-educated and purified. And the best way to remake those minds was through common toil in the fields alongside the peasants." In the following years, the Khmer Rouge transformed Cambodia into a nation-sized concentration camp. Once the evacuees reached their new home villages, they were made to sleep in barracks, eat in communal canteens, and surrender their young to the Khmer Rouge. All money and markets were banned, schools, books, religion, and prayer outlawed, and idle conversation, laughter, music, or tears at the wrong time could mean death. The people worked every day, with rare days off for political education. A workday would begin at 6 a.m. and could last until 10 in the evening. The people were worked to the point of death, receiving fewer than 1,200 calories a day and given no protection from the elements. By 1979, even Pol Pot admitted 80% of the peasants had contracted malaria. In many places, people fell dead while they worked. There were no practicing engineers, scientists, or doctors. These professions had been deemed unnecessary, and the Khmer Rouge believed any valuable knowledge or wisdom these roles contained were simple truths that could be picked up through experience. Those who held these jobs or attempted to continue practicing their disciplines were killed. Hang Ngo, the man whose quote began this video, was a doctor before the evacuations. When his wife went into labor, she developed life-threatening complications. Under the Khmer Rouge's new rules, to assist her in the delivery was punishable by death. To use his medical skills would have outed him as a professional and led to his wife's, and newborn's execution. He was forced to do nothing and could only hope that his wife would pull through. His wife and baby died. The Khmer Rouge would institute laws, all punishable by death, that extended onto families. There were killings for laziness, complaining, poor attitudes, or unsatisfactory work. A teacher who taught his pupils more skills than necessary to cultivate soil was executed by his pupils. A noose was placed around his neck, and the Khmer Rouge soldiers forced half a dozen children, aged 8 to 10, to pull the rope sharply while chanting, "Unfit teacher," until the man died. Love was not allowed, sex was forbidden, and little boys and girls who held hands were threatened with execution. Children were removed from their families at the age of 5 and placed in labor brigades. If the child died, which many did, the parents would be informed. If the parents wept or showed emotion, they were believed to be displaying bourgeois sentimentality, and their grief was a criticism of the Khmer Rouge. After all, the child had died for the revolution, and the parents should be proud. The unforgivable act of sentimentality was death. The Khmer Rouge destroyed any person they believed to have Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, or Lao ancestry. Even minority Cambodian ethnicities were sought out and killed. Cambodian children of mixed ethnicity parents were exterminated. Religious practitioners, Buddhist, Catholic, and Muslim, were eliminated, thrown into boiling waters, clubbed to death, tortured, disemboweled, or starved. As Pol Pot consolidated power, the paranoia of the top leaders increased. While the party members were exempt from the back-breaking work, they too could be killed for breaking minor rules. Not only did the despots fear one another, backstabbing and jockeying for position in the cabinet was not uncommon. They began fearing outside sabotage from the American CIA and began to see outside interference behind every delay and production failure. Those responsible for failures and delays would be thrown in prison and tortured until they confessed or pointed out collaborators. Paranoia was so great that interrogators who killed their victims too quickly were sometimes accused of outside collaboration and could be arrested themselves. From 1977 to 1978, hundreds of executions took place daily. Some 20,000 people died through execution, ensuring the security of the head office. In 1978, Pol Pot sought to purge Cambodia's eastern border with Vietnam, peasants and Khmer Rouge governors alike. The ensuing rebellion led to considerable fighting, but ultimately failed against the central government, leading to the death of 100,000 people. Pol Pot hated the Vietnamese and saw them as the primary threat to his revolution, more so than the United States, and began attacks across the border. The Khmer Rouge burnt villages, massacred civilians, and battled Viet Cong soldiers. More Vietnamese civilians were killed by the Khmer Rouge during their 45 months controlling Cambodia than were killed by U.S. soldiers for all of the Vietnam War. During Pol Pot's purge of eastern Cambodian regions, some 200,000 Vietnam troops surged across the Cambodian border. The lightly armed Khmer Rouge defenders were destroyed by Vietnamese heavy weapons, gunships, tanks, and professional soldiers who had just spent 20 years fighting the Americans. As the Vietnamese approached village after village, the peasants would revolt, turning on their captors, often with farm tools or their bare hands. The surviving Khmer Rouge were forced to march with the peasants and were often killed along the way as they relocated to regions along the Thai border. Remnants of the Khmer Rouge continued their guerrilla war against the Vietnamese-backed government of Cambodia. Pol Pot continued to lead the Khmer Rouge until his health declined. In 1997, he was placed under house arrest by his own party and died in 1998. The Khmer Rouge disbanded in 1999 after losing most of their support and territory. Many of their leaders defected or were captured, leading to their dissolution. In proportion to population, Cambodia suffered an unmatched human catastrophe. Out of a population of 7.1 million people in 1970, over 4 million lives were lost during the Khmer Rouge's rise, rebellion, and tyranny over Cambodia. For the relatively small population, by 1990, 20 years later, it would finally grow to nearly 7 million people again. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge in 1979, Hang Ngo worked as a doctor in a refugee camp in Thailand and left with his niece for the United States in 1980. Despite having no previous acting experience, he was cast as Dith Pran in The Killing Fields, for which he won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The Hang Ngo Foundation was organized in 1990 and raised funds to care for orphans and help rebuild the devastated country. In February 1996, outside his home in downtown Los Angeles, 3 gang members with prior arrests had robbed Ngo of his watch, and when he denied giving them his locket that contained a photo of his wife, he was shot dead. He was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California. After the release of The Killing Fields, Ngo had told the New York Times, "If I die from now on, okay. This film will go on for 100 years. Dith Pran, whom Ngo portrayed in The Killing Fields, said of his death, "He is like a twin with me. He is like a co-messenger. And right now, I am alone." Thank you for watching this episode of Tyrants in Tyranny. These stories, while difficult, are crucial. They remind us of the vigilance needed to protect our societies from falling into the hands of tyranny again. If this content resonates with you, or you feel it's important that these narratives are shared and remembered, consider supporting this channel through Patreon. Your support not only helps keep this channel alive, but also contributes to a broader understanding and awareness of historical truths. We're in this together, and it's by supporting one another that we ensure the past does not repeat itself. Stay informed, stay connected, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.